What if I told you that one of the greatest rock bands of all time didn't break up because of creative differences or money problems, but because of three words spoken about a new girlfriend? Today, we're diving deep into the real story behind the end of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. This isn't the polished version you've heard in interviews. This is the raw truth that came from someone who lived through it all. Someone who watched the same pattern destroy multiple legendary bands, and someone who finally revealed what really made reunion impossible forever. Stick around because what you're about to learn will change how you see rock history. Let me take you back to a time before the band even existed, back to when Neil Young was just a little boy dealing with something that would shape his entire life. In 1951, when Neil was only 5 years old, polio swept through Ontario, Canada, and he got caught right in the middle of this terrible outbreak. This wasn't just a bad cold or a fever. This was a disease that left his left side weak and made it impossible for him to walk for months. Can you imagine being 5 years old and suddenly not being able to do something as simple as walking? Doctors at the hospital in Toronto were really worried about him. They didn't know if he would make it through. His mother watched helplessly as her little boy had to drag himself across the living room floor, holding on to chairs and tables, learning how to take steps all over again. Every single movement was a struggle. Every day was a battle. And just when you think things couldn't get harder for this young child, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. This meant he needed insulin injections every single day and constant medical attention at an age when most kids are just playing with toys and learning simple things at school. The vaccine for polio wasn't even available until 1955, so Neil's recovery took a very long time. His family even took him all the way to Florida during the winter, hoping that warmer weather might help his body heal. He did eventually learn to stand and walk again, but a slight limp stayed with him for the rest of his life. This physical reminder of what he went through became a part of who he was, just like his music would later become part of rock and roll history. Those years of pain and struggle sank deep into his heart and mind, and they would later show up in his songs, where he poured out memories of feeling helpless and fighting to survive. But life wasn't finished testing young Neil. By 1960, when he was 14 years old, his home life fell apart in a different way. His father had been unfaithful to his mother multiple times, and she finally decided she'd had enough and filed for divorce. The family split in two, like someone had torn a photograph right down the middle. Neil moved to Winnipeg with his mother, while his older brothers stayed with their father back in Toronto. This change hit Neil like a punch to the stomach. He went from everything familiar to a working-class neighborhood where nothing felt the same. The emotional pain from his parents' divorce mixed with all those old wounds from being sick as a child, and together they shaped a teenage boy who felt unstable and uncertain about everything. But here's where something beautiful started to happen. That pain, all that hurt and confusion, became part of his identity, and later it fueled a restless spirit that kept showing up in his music, giving it a raw honesty that millions of people would connect with. School became Neil's escape from all the chaos at home. At his junior high school in Winnipeg, he found a friend who understood him and loved music just as much as he did. Together with this friend, Neil formed his first band. They called themselves the Jades, and they rehearsed in garages and school halls that echoed with their early attempts at rock and roll. Music became a bridge between everything Neil felt inside and everything he couldn't put into words. Eventually, the Jades evolved into a new band called the Squires in 1963. They actually recorded a single, and fewer than 300 copies were ever made. Those few records would later become treasured pieces of Canadian rock history. Neil's early steps in music were small, but they were steady, and they were shaped by this idea that music could be both an escape from pain and a way to survive through difficult times. As Neil grew older, that drive to make music pulled him farther and farther from home. In April of 1966, when he was just 20 years old, he reached Los Angeles after a long ride in an old hearse with only $100 in his pocket.
Now, why was he riding in a hearse? Because that's all he could afford at the time. Before reaching Los Angeles, he had spent his late teenage years playing folk music in Toronto coffee houses, desperately trying to find a door that would open for him in the music world. Then something incredible happened, and it happened because another band fell apart. Neil had been part of a band, but their lead singer got arrested for being absent without leave from the United States Navy. So Neil and another musician left Toronto and headed to California without any real plan at all. They were just hoping something good would happen. And on April 6, 1966, while stuck in traffic on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, two familiar faces recognized the Canadian license plates on Neil's hearse. These were musicians Neil knew, and they pulled over to say hello. That single moment, that random meeting in traffic on a crowded road, changed Neil's future forever. Within just a few days, Buffalo Springfield was born. This new band moved incredibly quickly. Buffalo Springfield formed in May of 1966 and released their first album only 6 months later, in December. Their music mixed folk, country, British rock influences, and psychedelic sounds. This combination created something that fit perfectly into the Los Angeles counterculture scene of the late 60s. They had a huge hit song that came out in December 1966 and sold over 1 million copies in the United States. They played major venues, appeared on television, and released their second album in November 1967. But here's where things get complicated, and this is where we start to see a pattern that would repeat itself over and over in Neil's life. The speed of their success created pressure that none of them were ready to handle. Neil began disappearing from rehearsals and shows as early as 1967. The band struggled with never knowing if Neil would show up or gone again. Behind the scenes, his mind was cracking under the weight of everything happening so fast. He later said that success came too quickly and he wasn't mature enough to handle it. Neil also struggled with epilepsy, which made everything even harder because he never knew when a seizure might hit. He had one seizure right on stage, and he feared that people would see him collapse and walk away from him. People who worked with him remembered how he would tremble in front of the microphone, his voice sounding like he was about to fall apart. His emotional struggle became a physical one, and it spilled into the band's work and relationships. The pressure just kept building and building. Between 1966 and 1968, Neil left Buffalo Springfield and came back more than 3 times. He would simply vanish without warning, leaving the band completely unsure if he would show up at their next performance. In January 1967, he walked away just before they were supposed to appear on a huge television show. He came back later, then left again by spring. His anxiety, his seizures, and his frustration with the band's direction made him completely unpredictable. The group actually learned to perform without knowing if he would be standing beside them or gone again. Everything completely fell apart around a major music festival in June 1967. This festival was a defining moment for 1960s rock music, and almost every major artist was there. Neil refused to join Buffalo Springfield at this festival. He said it felt too commercial and beneath them. The band's final show took place in May of 1968. After that performance, Neil walked away for good, and Buffalo Springfield collapsed. The band's life was short but incredibly powerful, and Neil's decision to leave shaped the end of one of the most influential bands of that time. Now, while Neil's music career was going through all this chaos, his personal life was changing just as quickly. In December of 1968, Neil got married to a woman named Susan, who was a dancer and artist. She was part of the artistic community and introduced Neil to important artists and became part of his early creative identity. But their marriage lasted only until 1970. The pressure of fame and Neil's emotional struggles pushed him away from the relationship. Susan later said that Neil was someone who always ran from problems whenever things got difficult. And here's the key part. That tendency kept returning throughout his entire life. This wasn't just a one-time thing. This was a pattern. After divorcing Susan, Neil fell into a new relationship in an actress in 1970. She had just received major award nominations and was at the peak of her Hollywood career, but she stepped away from all of that to be with Neil. Their son was born in 1972 with mild cerebral palsy. She put her entire career aside and focused on caring for their son. They lived on Neil's massive ranch in Northern California, but by 1975, Neil told her he needed to move on. She said he would disappear for long stretches of time, leaving her and their son to move through rental houses without knowing when he would return. In 1983, she had to sue Neil for child support. The court required him to pay thousands of dollars each month and even more money to buy a home for her and their son. Neil stayed completely silent about this publicly. Their relationship never healed, and she died in 2004, still estranged from Neil. Their son grew up mostly without his father's presence, and the lawsuit showed how deeply fame and emotional distance could tear a family apart.
Now let's talk about how Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young actually came together. After Buffalo Springfield fell apart in 1968, one of Neil's former bandmates didn't want to slow down. He kept looking for something new, something that felt alive and exciting. That search led him toward David Crosby, who had just been pushed out of his previous band for being too difficult to work with, and Graham Nash, who had walked away from his successful British band after falling in love with the American music scene. When Nash flew into Los Angeles in December of that year, the three of them met and tried singing together. The blend of their voices surprised everyone. Their harmonies locked in so smoothly that it felt like they had been doing it for years. That natural chemistry carried them straight into making an album in 1969, which took off fast and made them believe they had captured something really rare and special. But when it came time to tour and play live shows, they realized they needed someone who could strengthen their sound on stage. Neil's former bandmate mentioned bringing in Neil Young. Graham Nash wasn't sure about this idea. Neil had already built a reputation for being both brilliant and completely unpredictable at the same time. He was known for walking into a room and changing its entire atmosphere, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Even so, Neil finally agreed to join them, but only after getting a contract that guaranteed he could keep making his own solo albums and touring on his own. This was the first time a band had to deal with a member who stepped in with one foot already pointed toward the exit door. That attitude showed itself right from the very beginning, and it would become a defining feature of Neil's time with the group. Their first major show together was at the legendary Woodstock Festival in August of 1969, performing in front of more than 400,000 people. It should have been an absolutely perfect moment because the entire world was watching, but Neil refused to be filmed. That single choice erased him from one of rock's biggest historical moments. The famous Woodstock documentary showed Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but not Neil Young. To this day, many people don't even realize Neil stood on that stage that night. The one moment that could have introduced the full group to the world slipped away because Neil didn't want cameras pointing at him. The whirlwind of their early success pushed them straight into the recording studio to make their only proper album together. They worked on it from July 1969 to January 1970, and everything swirling in their personal lives kept spilling into the recording sessions. Crosby was grieving the loss of his girlfriend, Nash and the other member were coming out of painful breakups, Neil had already begun pulling back emotionally from the others. Arguments became a daily routine during recording. Neil clashed with the drummer over musical tempos and directions. Another member of the band actually fired the bass player before they even hit the road for their tour, claiming the bass player had changed overnight. The entire situation became so chaotic that they ended up replacing musicians with people they barely knew. These choices told everyone what kind of storm they were all living through together. The album eventually took almost 800 hours to finish, and every single hour carried the weight of tension, brilliance, heartbreak, and clashing egos. By May of 1970, the pressure had spread from the recording studio to the stage during their live performances. During a show in Denver, Neil got into a heated fight with the drummer that nearly made him quit the entire tour. Neil wanted the music to move in one direction, while the drummer pushed in another direction. The friction exploded, and Neil walked off the stage ready to be completely done with the whole thing.
One of the other members panicked because he knew the group couldn't survive another fracture, so he made the decision to fire the drummer right after the show, hoping this would calm Neil down and keep him in the band. Instead of making things better, this decision only made the tension between band members even worse. One member began leaning heavily on drugs and alcohol just to get through the days and nights. The tour kept going, but by that point, it felt like everyone was moving through thick fog, carrying bruised pride and quiet grudges that they couldn't talk about openly. Things continued to get worse instead of better. At a famous venue in New York, one band member found out that Bob Dylan was sitting in the audience watching them. In a burst of ego and desire to impress Dylan, this member decided to walk out alone and perform a long solo set that none of the others had agreed to or even knew was happening. Crosby, Stills, and Nash sat backstage completely stunned and angry, feeling like their bandmate had claimed the entire night for himself. His solo performance went on for more than an hour, pushing the others so far emotionally that when the venue wanted them to come back for encore performances, the band refused to come out until the staff actually slid $800 in cash under their dressing room door. Nash later said that moment was one of the absolute lowest points because it showed how far the group had drifted from the unity and brotherhood they once imagined they had. The unraveling of the band only grew sharper and more painful as time went on. In July of 1970, when they returned to Chicago for 2 nights of performances, the atmosphere backstage felt heavy and exhausted. Arguments would flare up just minutes before they were supposed to go on stage. Old wounds kept reopening. Crosby, Nash, and Neil finally reached a point where they couldn't push forward anymore. They made the decision to walk away and quit the tour right in the middle of it. They left the remaining concert dates behind and ended the band before the group had even spent a full year together performing. Later, Crosby said the band had simply run its course and burned itself out. An album of their live performances came out in 1971 as a reminder of what they had created together and what they had lost. Now, during all of this chaos with the band, Neil's personal life shifted in yet another direction. In December of 1974, he walked into a small diner near his ranch in California, still carrying the emotional weight of his recent breakup. Behind the counter was a young waitress named Peggy Morton. She lived in a tent with her dog, living a simple life far away from the world of fame and endless tours. Neil noticed her right away. Something about her grounded, down-to-earth presence felt completely different from all the chaos he had been living through. He later even wrote a song about that first moment when he saw her working in that diner. Their meeting marked the start of a quiet connection that would grow slowly and last for many decades. After 4 years of knowing each other and building their relationship, Neil married Peggy in August of 1978 at his beach home. The ceremony was small and private, reflecting the calmer, more peaceful life Neil hoped to build with her. Peggy wasn't part of the music world at all. She didn't chase spotlights or fame. Her steady, reliable nature helped Neil settle down in ways he hadn't expected or experienced before. Their life together changed even more when they welcomed their son in 1978 and later their daughter in 1984.
Their son was diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy and needed constant care and attention. Neil also shared custody of his older son from a previous relationship, who also had cerebral palsy. With 3 children dealing with serious medical challenges, Peggy became the absolute center of their family. She carried the enormous emotional and physical demands with incredible strength, helping Neil find purpose and meaning beyond just fame and music success. Their struggles as parents pushed them toward doing something bigger than themselves. In 1986, after realizing that there were no schools equipped to meet their son's special needs, Neil and Peggy decided to create one themselves. They organized a huge benefit concert, bringing in massive artists to raise money. The school opened in 1987 and quickly became a leader in helping children with severe physical and communication challenges. Their shared mission turned their private pain into something that created a lifeline for other families dealing with similar struggles. That school still helps families today, decades later.
Meanwhile, throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young kept trying to make things work again. In May of 1973, they all came together at Neil's ranch, hoping that the storms of the past were finally behind them. The plan was simple: spend time together, write songs, sing, and create an album while mixing work with sunshine and ocean air. They even took their recording sessions to Hawaii and rehearsed on David Crosby's boat. For a brief moment, it felt like the old magic was drifting back into their relationship. Strong songs started taking shape, and everyone felt a small spark that told them this reunion could really work this time. But those familiar cracks in their relationships surfaced before long. One argument led to another, and soon the same old fights that had torn them apart before started filling the space between them again. The momentum completely fell apart, and what had once been a promising recording session turned into another abandoned dream. Some of the songs they worked on survived in pieces and showed up in later concerts, but the album everyone once believed in went absolutely nowhere and wouldn't exist as a full release for many, many years. A year later, in 1974, the group tried again during what people started calling their Doom Tour. From the outside, the world saw giant stadiums packed with fans, roaring crowds, private jets flying the band from city to city, fancy hotels, and wild backstage scenes. But inside the group, something dark kept growing larger and more destructive. One night, a simple disagreement about a musical harmony turned into something far worse. Crosby didn't like a harmony part that another member insisted on using for his song. As the tension jumped higher and higher, this member completely snapped. He grabbed a razor blade and actually slashed the master recording tape of Nash's song, destroying hours of work in a moment of rage. He later tried to brush it off as just a joke, but the damage hit everyone in places they couldn't even talk about. They finished the tour because the money and contracts pushed them forward, but they walked away from those stadiums more divided and hurt than they had ever been before. In 1976, they tried yet again, gathering in Miami for what they hoped would be a fresh start. Everyone hoped that time had smoothed the rough edges of their relationships, but when Crosby and Nash left temporarily to finish their own separate album as a duo, the other two members decided to strike back in the most hurtful way possible. They actually erased Crosby and Nash's voices from the master recording tapes, wiping away months of teamwork in a single act of revenge. No album came from those sessions either. The pattern just kept repeating itself over and over. Years later, Neil explained in interviews that he never left bands because of hate or anger. He said he wanted his music to stay in a place where it could breathe and grow naturally. If that feeling vanished and the music started feeling forced or fake, he would walk away so his love for music could survive somewhere else, in a different project or with different people. That idea guided him when he left Buffalo Springfield, and later when he drifted away from Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young again and again and again. Now, while Neil was protecting his music by walking away, David Crosby was fighting battles of his own with something far darker than creative differences. By 1976, Crosby had completely destroyed parts of his body from years of heavy drug use. He had moved on to even more dangerous drugs, smoking massive amounts every single day. He mixed different drugs together and spiraled into a life that blended addiction, fear, and complete disorientation from reality. He fell into constant legal trouble. Even after having a medical seizure in 1982 that ended with him crashing his car into a concrete divider, he still somehow believed he was in control of his life. Police found drugs and a gun inside his car. Soon he was arrested again, already out on bail from previous charges. The list of drugs they found on him grew long enough to shock even the people who knew him best and had watched his decline for years. His addiction tore through his finances and destroyed most of his important relationships. It left him isolated, paranoid, and convinced he could somehow fix everything on his own without help. In December of 1985, everything finally collapsed completely. He reached the dock where his boat was parked, wearing almost nothing and realizing he couldn't sail anywhere or run anymore. Instead of trying to escape again, he turned himself in to the police. That moment led him to prison, and for months the entire world watched his downfall unfold in newspaper headlines. Crosby later said that going to prison actually saved his life and helped him crawl back towards sobriety and health. But the damage he caused during those dark years sat deep inside every friendship he had, especially with Neil and with the other band members. Even after getting clean and sober, the physical scars from his drug years carried into his health for the rest of his life. He battled serious diseases and even required a liver transplant, constant reminders of how close he came to losing absolutely everything, including his life. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young came together for several reunion tours. But these gatherings weren't built on genuine friendship anymore. They had become business arrangements, contracts to fulfill, money to be made. Tours in the year 2000 sold out everywhere, with expensive tickets and long shows filled with almost 30 songs. Neil would show up, play incredibly well, and then slide right back into his solo work as soon as the contracts were completed. More tours came in later years, but the warmth and brotherhood of earlier years never returned. Each man focused primarily on his own path, and only their shared history and the promise of money pushed them into the same room together again. As time moved on, Crosby became more and more vocal about his frustration with Neil's fierce independence. In various interviews, he called Neil the most selfish person he had ever known. He said Neil only cared about himself and that he was absolutely impossible to work with for any extended period. Crosby also admitted honestly that money mattered to him and that he wanted reunion tours to happen even when the real friendship wasn't there anymore between them. His old fights with Nash resurfaced during this time too, and he accused Nash of choosing money over loyalty to their friendship.
Through all of this ongoing drama, Neil's pattern stayed exactly the same as it had always been. Peggy Young, his wife of 36 years, once explained something really important. She said that Neil always left situations when things drifted away from their original meaning and purpose. He joined Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, then walked away in 1970. He left Buffalo Springfield after just 2 years. He stepped back from personal relationships when they no longer felt like home to him. Each and every time he returned to his own solo work and to his backing band, Crazy Horse, the place where his music always seemed to breathe easiest and feel most natural. Friends said he walked away not out of cruelty or meanness, but because he absolutely refused to watch anything he loved dissolve into something fake or forced. That pattern reached deep into his personal life too, not just his music career. And then came the event that would change everything forever and make reunion truly impossible. On July 29, 2014, Neil filed for divorce from Peggy. Fans were absolutely stunned when they heard this news. For years and years, people had seen Neil and Peggy as rock music's steady couple, true partners in music, and parents who had pushed through everything together. Peggy responded by filing her own divorce papers a few weeks later. Rumors appeared almost immediately that Neil had already begun seeing actress Daryl Hannah before his marriage to Peggy had officially ended. The divorce moved quietly through the courts, but the news hit really hard for people who thought the bond between Neil and Peggy would last forever. Soon it became crystal clear that Neil and Daryl Hannah had grown very close, long before the divorce papers were ever filed. They had worked together for years on various projects, and their friendship had slowly turned into something deeper and more romantic. The timing of everything hurt Peggy deeply, and the public took sides, with many people feeling that Neil had abandoned the woman who had supported him through decades of challenges.
For someone who had spent so many years supporting Neil, on stage and off, caring for their children with special needs, and building that benefit school with him, the split felt like a sudden fracture she never expected or prepared for emotionally. The situation turned absolutely explosive in September of 2014 when David Crosby gave an interview to a reporter. In that interview, Crosby called Daryl Hannah harsh names, saying very negative things about her character and claiming he feared Neil would get hurt in this new relationship. He said the whole situation saddened him greatly. Those words raced across the internet like wildfire and sparked a reaction from Neil that nobody had quite expected, even though everyone knew Neil could hold grudges. Neil's response was immediate and permanent. He publicly stated that he would never, ever reunite with Crosby, Stills, and Nash again. He refused to even say Crosby's name out loud, and instead began referring to the group only as Stills, Nash, and Young, completely erasing Crosby from the band's name when he spoke about them. Neil said something really important in his statement. He said people must think carefully before they speak, and that if someone makes a terrible mistake with their words, they should fix it immediately and sincerely. But he believed Crosby's public words about Daryl were too damaging, too hurtful, and too far over the line to ever repair, no matter how much time passed. Months later, in May of 2015, Crosby sat down for an interview and apologized publicly on the air. He admitted he was completely out of line with his comments. He said he himself was far more messed up than Daryl Hannah had ever been and had absolutely no right to judge her or anyone else's personal life. He revealed that he had tried calling Neil multiple times to apologize directly, but Neil never accepted the apology or returned his calls. The wound in their relationship remained open and bleeding, and no reunion between the four of them ever happened again after that point. This is where Peggy's perspective becomes so important to understanding the whole story. Peggy Young passed away on January 1, 2019, at age 66 after battling cancer. Friends close to her said she never fully recovered emotionally from the divorce. She poured all of her heartbreak into making a music album of her own, calling it the soundtrack to the 7 stages of grief that people go through after losing something precious. She never remarried and held on to memories of the life she had once believed would last until they were both old. Her death added a heavy silence to the end of her story with Neil, a story filled with genuine love, tremendous loss, and so many unanswered questions about what might have been if things had gone differently. Before Peggy died, she had shared her understanding of Neil's pattern with people close to her. She explained that Neil had always been someone who ran from situations when they stopped feeling right to him. She had watched him do this with Buffalo Springfield decades before she even knew him. She watched him do it repeatedly with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and then she experienced it herself when he left their marriage after 36 years together. She understood that Neil wasn't necessarily a cruel person, but he was someone who valued authenticity and genuine feeling above everything else, even above loyalty and commitment to people who had supported him through his darkest times. What Peggy revealed to friends was that Neil's pattern wasn't really about any single person or any single comment. Yes, Crosby's words about Daryl Hannah were the final straw that made reunion impossible. Yes, those 3 words calling Daryl harsh names ended any chance of the band standing on the same stage again. But the deeper truth was that Neil had already been pulling away emotionally from Crosby, Stills, and Nash for decades. Every reunion tour was just a business transaction to him. Every time they came back together, he was already planning his exit strategy back to his solo work. Neil understood that Crosby's comment about Daryl gave Neil the perfect excuse to do what he had wanted to do anyway, which was to cut ties permanently and never look back. It wasn't really about defending Daryl's honor, although that was certainly part of it. It was about Neil's lifelong pattern of walking away from anything that no longer felt authentic to him, anything that felt like it was running on nostalgia instead of genuine creative energy and brotherhood. David Crosby's story reached its final chapter in January 18, 2023, when he died at 81. In his very last interviews before he passed away, Crosby admitted that his biggest regret in his entire life was the comment he had made about Daryl Hannah back in 2014. He knew with absolute certainty that those words ended any chance for Crosby, Stills, and Nash to ever stand on the same stage again. He had also drifted apart from Graham Nash during his final years, even though Nash later said publicly that they were actually very close to reconnecting and healing their friendship before Crosby suddenly passed away. In the end, Crosby spent his final years thinking about all the small conflict and stubborn pride that had kept great music from being made and kept old friends from reconciling before it was too late. When Crosby died, the door to any possible reunion closed forever. There was no longer even a theoretical possibility of the four of them coming back together one more time. Graham Nash finally said it out loud in public in March of 2016, even before Crosby's death. He announced that Crosby, Stills, and Nash was completely done and over. The band had ended after 47 years of on and off collaboration. He explained that the tension with Crosby had become poisonous and destructive, and that the wounds between all of them were simply too deep to heal, no matter how much time passed, no matter how much money was offered for reunion tours. It was truly the end of a long, beautiful, painful journey that gave the world incredible music, but it also caused tremendous personal damage to everyone involved. Neil Young married Daryl Hannah in 2018, confirming the marriage publicly later that year. They have continued living their lives away from all the old noise and drama, while Neil has kept right on touring and creating new music well into his late 70s. Friends who know him well say he has stayed true to the exact same internal compass he has followed his entire life. He chooses authenticity over comfort every single time. He walks away from anything that doesn't feel real to him anymore, regardless of how much money is involved or how much history exists. People close to him say the final truth of Neil Young's legacy is actually quite simple when you really think about it. He has always walked away at the peak of things, not because of one specific fight or one specific insult, but because he has absolutely refused to stay in places where love and creative purpose have faded away. He left Buffalo Springfield in 1968 for this reason. He left Crosby, Stills, and Nash in 1970 for the exact same reason. He felt the original spark slipping away and the music becoming more about business than about genuine artistic expression. When music stopped feeling alive and real to him, he stepped back and carried his creativity somewhere else where it could breathe naturally again. That instinct shaped every break he made, every reunion he agreed to, and every goodbye he said. And in the end, that same instinct shaped both the rise and ultimate fall of one of rock music's most legendary groups. So what really ended Crosby, Stills, and Nash? It wasn't just David Crosby's comment about Daryl Hannah, although that was certainly the match that lit the final fire. It wasn't just ego clashes or drug problems or creative differences, although all of those things played important roles throughout the decades. What really ended the band, according to those who knew them best, especially Peggy Young,